So Vladimir Putin has had another bad week in Ukraine. Has this war of choice backfired on him? Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Reiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So the big news today is that a Russian warship was destroyed and ultimately sunk in the Black Sea just off the Ukrainian coast. Now, what's interesting about this development is that the Ukrainians and Russians have different explanations about what happened. Let's start with the Russian one. The Russians claim that mysteriously a fire developed on this ship, which is, by the way, an extremely modern missile cruiser that is actually the flagship of their Black Sea fleet. The Black Sea, as you know, is the water body that's located on the southeastern border of Ukraine and the southwestern border of Russia. So this mysterious fire started, resulting in all kinds of explosions on the ship, according to the Russians, resulting in the evacuation of almost 5,000 sailors. And ultimately, as they were towing the ship to port, it sank. This loss was so consequential that the Russians could not hide it from their domestic audience, and it was reported on their national news, which is something that the Russians have done their best to try to avoid. That is, reporting bad news on what's going on in Ukraine to Russia, thus demonstrating that this was a significant loss. Now, if you believe that this modern battle cruiser just happened to have a fire develop somewhere on it that ended up destroying it, well, I've got a bridge in Brooklyn that might interest you. Much more plausible, I think, is the explanation given by the Ukrainians, which is that they shot a missile at the ship. This missile caused an explosion that ultimately destroyed the ship. Now, is this strategically going to make a change in the war? Probably not, but it certainly is more bad news that the Russians really don't want. What's more is it's probably going to kind of change the tactics that the Russians have in terms of how they're managing the Black Sea coast. I mean, one thing that's been clear from the start of this is that the Russians want to be able to occupy, ideally, all of the Ukrainian Black Sea coast, so that they essentially make Ukraine into a landlocked country. What's more is this is why they've done so much to try to take the besieged city of Mariupol, despite the resistance of the Ukrainians. Mariupol is a port on the Black Sea. Ideally, though, it's clear that the Russians want to take Odessa, which is a major port of the Ukraine on the Black Sea, and one of the country's largest cities. But the truth of the matter is, so far, they've been held back by the Ukrainian army. In response, the Russians have basically brought their navy in on the Black Sea to basically blockade the southern ports of Ukraine. Well, now that this modern missile cruiser has been destroyed by the Ukrainians, my guess is the Soviets, again, I keep saying that, the Russians will be a little more circumspect and might want to move their ships farther away where they won't be in such danger of attack by missiles. That could potentially weaken the Russian offensive, which now is focusing more on the south and the east of the country after they failed so spectacularly in taking Kyiv. Indeed, the United States has now doubled down on sending weapons to Ukraine, adding another almost $800 million to what we've already sent, bringing the total of the Biden administration's arms shipments to Ukraine to over $3 billion. Reportedly, we have shipments being sent to Ukraine around the clock every day at this point. And this latest shipment is reported to include some heavier arms, things like, for example, howitzers, which are very large guns. Now, the reason this matters is the area around Kyiv tends to be heavily forested, so it provided a lot of cover for the Ukrainian military. They were able to basically hide out and force the Russian tanks onto streets and then attack them and kind of bog them down. The problem with this eastern area, aside from the fact that there are some groups who are heavily supportive of the Russians in that part of the country, is that this tends to be more open. These are the plains where they grow the Ukrainian wheat that's actually the basis for the wheat that we grow here in the United States. The thought is that this will provide more maneuverability to the Russians with their tanks and slow helicopters. By providing the Ukrainians with heavier weapons like these howitzers, that will enable us to kind of counter the more open space and the freedom that gives to the Russian forces. So if, as it turns out, the Russians are unable to rely upon their navy on the southern part of the country on the Black Sea, then that will make it even harder for their offensive to succeed then in southeastern Ukraine. But this invasion is backfiring even more than Vladimir Putin could have imagined. Right now, you have the Europeans talking in Brussels about banning Russian oil imports. Now, that's something that Putin bet would never happen. The Europeans are very reliant on shipments of oil and gas from Russia, and so as a result of that, he believes that there's no way the Europeans would ever ban it. They'd continue to be supplying money for his treasury to back his war as he shipped energy to Europe. So the idea that the Europeans could be talking about actually banning oil, despite the fact that it might have negative consequences on their own economies, just shows how isolated Russia has become as a result of Putin's war of choice. What's more is Putin's justification for this war is that he was angry at the incursion of NATO closer and closer to Russia's borders. Well, NATO, which stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is an organization based in Brussels that is essentially the US-led coalition of Western European nations that was set up to counter the threat of the Soviet Union in Europe. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, there were a group of Eastern European countries that were allowed to join, including Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland, 3 countries which, by the way, border Ukraine. Well, as a result of these aggressive actions by Russia, a number of NATO member states, which had been, let's say, a little less enthusiastic about the alliance for the simple fact that they've had basically strong men come into power. And I am thinking of Turkey, for example, and Hungary and Poland. Well, we've seen those countries drawing closer to NATO. And indeed, the United States has sent over 14,000 more U.S. troops into our NATO allies right up on the border there. And to make matters even worse for Putin, now Finland and Sweden, 2 countries that border Russia on its northwestern side, are talking about joining their fellow Scandinavian country, Norway, as members of NATO. This would be a huge shock to the system for the Russians, who have generally assumed that that border was nothing to worry about. In fact, at the beginning of World War II, they invaded Finland and were basically fought back by the Finns in what's often called the Winter War. In response to that, and to essentially stop the Russians from invading them again, the Finns had basically agreed that they would remain neutral, a position that was also shared by the Swedes, who also don't want to mess with the Soviets and ultimately the Russians right up there on their northeastern border. Well, now, out of fear of the erratic behavior by Vladimir Putin, these countries are talking about joining NATO. Again, exactly the opposite of what Vladimir Putin was hoping to accomplish with this invasion. And finally, recent polling has shown that Vladimir Putin's image has taken a beating worldwide. Where at one point he was perceived as fearsome and formidable, now people are much less impressed with him. Nobody's finding him too intimidating or a genius, as Donald Trump argued. No, instead, now they're perceiving him as a weak, pathetic, authoritarian leader. Exactly the opposite, by the way, of what he wanted to be perceived as. And ultimately, given the ego that Putin has, one comparable to Donald Trump's, this might be the ultimate backfire to his Ukrainian invasion. Well, if you want to find out more about how Vladimir Putin has had a couple of bad weeks in Ukraine, check out this video over here. My guess is right about now Vladimir Putin's thinking to himself, boy, I wish we hadn't done this. I'll see you then, and in the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.